Hello, StarCon. My name is Keefer Rourke. I'm an undergraduate research assistant at the University of Guelph School of Computer Science. And among other things, this talk is about some anti-patterns that I've noticed in web development. And I also hope that it will serve as a quick primer for internet security and privacy and some of the implications thereof. So before I really get started, I think it's important that everyone has an understanding of where we came from and how we got to be here. So I'm going to begin my talk with an admittedly shitty history of computing. So a really long time ago, a guy named George Boole formalized a set of rules into something that we call binary symbolic logic. This is something that you may have learned in a discrete math class or philosophy or whatever. And then a little bit less long ago, some really clever people implemented this logic in some really clever ways and invented digital circuits. This led to the invention of computers, which pretty much everyone in this room and around the world has unanimously agreed are useful tools. So much so that we have them in our homes, in our offices, and eventually we started carrying them around in our pockets. So at this point in our timeline, this marks something that a lot of people call an information revolution. So this is a point in time when information flowed freely across the World Wide Web, and it's almost where we are today, except that it's not. Today, we are drowning in applications and services which are all vying for your attention in order to turn a profit. And they do this using content aggregators, targeted advertising, and in some cases, downright spying. Today, you have no privacy, and this is bad. The internet was designed as a tool to allow people to share content and knowledge with almost no restrictions. But unfortunately, it has also enabled mass surveillance at an unprecedented scale. And this has to do with a shift in a careful balance between privacy and power. And now, privacy does not practically exist. I'm unhappy with this, and so I propose something called privacy-oriented design. I'm going to define this term as an approach to software development which minimizes extraneous information collection and maximizes user privacy. This might go as far as actively discarding unneeded information. I think that everyone should be concerned about each other's right to privacy, because if you take away one's right to privacy, then you've explicitly created a power imbalance, and power imbalances are bad for society. So I'm just going to, as a simple example of a privacy-oriented design, we're going to take a look at a radio. Radios operate on a simple protocol where a user selects a frequency, broadcasts a message, and then waits for a response, if any. It's anonymous by design. Communication is one way, and there's absolutely no metadata. You only have the information, which is your transmission frequency, your message, and the time of your broadcast. I also think that radios are kind of fun. So that's just a simple example, and I'm going to contrast this with the way the internet works. So things get a little bit messier here because the protocol is way different. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with HTTP requests, the way they work is kind of like initiating a handshake with a stranger, except that instead of extending your hand in warm greeting, it's more like taking a big pile of papers and chucking at them as hard as you can. So what we have is a client, which is like your laptop or your phone, which is going to send a bunch of information to a server which is located somewhere in the cloud. It's not actually a cloud, by the way. And then it's going to ask the server to do something with some small subset of this information. So to explain what's going on here, you have a request header, which details something like your request method. It also details exactly where you came from. This might be like the full URL of the last web page you visited. And it details who you are. So from this truncated user agent string, this details like a lot of information. So for instance, we know that I'm using a Mozilla-like browser. This could be Firefox, Chromium, or any derivative thereof. We know my operating system, which is Linux. We know my processor architecture, which can now be used to determine if, for instance, I'm vulnerable to the recently disclosed Spectre and Meltdown attacks. Disclaimer, I am, and you are. And curiously enough, it also details that I'm using X11 as my display server. For the Linux nerds in the crowd, no, I haven't switched over to Wayland yet, and no, I'm really not sure why a web server wants to know this. And that's really not even half of an HTTP header. And there's a whole mess of other information which can be queried easily by a server through a web application, or is made available elsewhere, like otherwise. This data might include a list of browser add-ons that you've installed, unique browser hashes, details about your display, etc. And if you're really interested about the more details about this information, I would encourage you to take a look at the Electronic Frontier Foundation's Panopticlick tool, which has tons of information here. And when I ran a simple test with a fresh Chromium installation, I found that I was uniquely identifiable out of well over 1 million already tested browsers. And that's kind of a scary thought to me. But it's not all bad, because HTTP lets you do a lot more with communications than a radio does. It's just not inherently private. Or it doesn't yield privacy. You can have private and secure communications, but in order to initiate this communication, you have to give them a copy of your fingerprints, your home address, and your passport to every server that you connect to. You wouldn't ever do this with a stranger in real life, and I'm not sure why you would want to do this on the internet either, but this is built into the protocol. So earlier this year, one of the most profound things that I heard was that the only safe data set is the null data set. That is to say that data is so abstract, ubiquitous, and easy to manipulate that it's also really easy to cause harm with it. So the German word on display here loosely translates to the practice of keeping and using only the required information in a set. And it's basically the opposite of big data. And it's a philosophy that I hope that you guys will be able to consider seriously. Because when you collect and store hundreds, millions, if not trillions of points of data, that starts raising red flags about your intent. In a rather absurd but real example, Facebook sometimes asks users for actual copies of their government ID when they're locked out of their accounts. And this makes me ask questions like, why do you want to uniquely identify me? Why do you want to know my political alignment? Why do you want to log all of my activity on the internet? Why are you following me? Are you trying to dissuade or disallow certain speech, which is a reality across much of the globe right now as political powers shift? Or are you just trying to sell me shoes? So, Martin Fowler wrote really excellent blog posts of the same title on this subject back in 2013, which I'm going to quote here. The default attitude at the moment is that any data that you generate is not just freely usable by the capturer, but furthermore becomes their valuable commercial property. And this is more true than ever today, and I also think that it's more dangerous, because a lot of poor assumptions are often made using imprecise metadata and pseudoscience as a proxy for reality. So how do you solve this problem of having too much data? Well, you have to put your data on a diet, and this includes actively discarding it. So in a really simple web application, this might be as easy as just turning off access logging in Nginx. That's a single line of code here. And toning down your analytics software. More complex applications might require a redesign. So this is important because in any administrative or development role, there's a huge power differential between your user and a host. So from the time that we're little, we're often told, don't lie, don't cheat, don't cause harm, don't take advantage of those who are less fortunate than you. And this is a simple moral code that is just common sense and forms the basis of a lot of social contracts, where we basically expect people to be nice to one another. In positions of power, however, it's particularly easy to get away with ignoring this moral code. So if you consider a scenario where maybe you've built a large system that people trust with important personal information, such as credit card numbers, passwords, email addresses, phone numbers, networks of contacts, all that like, you as the maintainer and administrator of the system have the responsibility to protect this information from incessant attacks across the internet to the best of your ability, ensure the integrity of this information, avoid looking at this information personally, and also protect this information from any insiders by implementing levels of access. Failure to do really any of these things is potentially abuse by negligence, as was the case with Equifax's leak last year, and countless other cases of bad security. But it's also about a lot more than just security, because you need to have a really good sense of ethics if you're going to do anything with user-generated content. You need to ensure that you're treating users fairly and ensuring equal opportunity. You need to ensure that there are fair moderation systems in place and that there's no potential for abuse through this moderation. And you also need to ensure that minority voices are not squashed by accident. So, reality check. You're going to do web development. The internet is scary, and you shouldn't do it alone. Everyone screws up. This includes Facebook. So, in 2014, Facebook introduced a new feature called Your Year in Review. This was a system that highlighted posts using engagement as a proxy for content filtering. And on the right, a Facebook user was reminded that their apartment was brutally destroyed in a fire. There were worse examples. This is rather tame. People were shown painful memories in a really cheery and inappropriate context, and that was really upsetting to a lot of people. Facebook had to publicly apologize profusely. At this point in time, Facebook may have partially solved their context problem by introducing reactions recently, but I'm of the opinion that the entirety of the human experience cannot be summed up into 6 emojis. So, lesson from this: please don't presume that everyone has the same worldview and experiences, because the human experience is dynamic, and problems like this one are ignorant at best. But not everything on the internet that's bad is ignorant. Some of it is like deliberately abusive. And there are a lot of anti-patterns that I've noticed in web development over the past few years. So for instance, lying to your users, who are real trusting people, by doing something like, for instance, telling them that location services are turned off when in fact they are actually still on. Google admitted to doing this with Android back in 2017. Aggressive user profiling and tracking, which can be alienating and is invasive. Introducing hidden anti-features, such as the recently popular idea of mining Bitcoin in someone's browser through an ad iframe. Teaching and treating people as a commodity by selling private information, and really doing anything without explicit consent. And when you look at the internet, you often see censorship come up as a problem very often, because internet giants are tasked with combating trolls, removing hate speech, complying with local, federal, and international content laws, and censorship and filtering need to be implemented very carefully. If you consider a scheme which blocks users from making a post that contains certain keywords that are flagged as hate speech, on the surface, this might seem like a really good way to prevent the spread of hateful messages. But if you then also consider that people are usually smarter than systems, they can get around this scheme by using alternative spellings, creative acronyms, and other media types to spread their message. So suddenly your scheme that you've just cleverly thought of and implemented has been defeated and rendered ineffective. And all it's done is potentially blocked productive conversation on controversial topics like dealing with systemic discrimination and political unrest. This is a slippery slope. If you consider that major platforms that already use mechanisms to spy on your internet activity and also censor your speech, we need to tread very, very carefully unless you're a particularly big fan of a very negative aspect of a certain novel by George Orwell. So, if you're going to attack this kind of problem, you need to think very carefully. You need to get feedback from your community. So issue trackers and venues for obtaining voluntary user feedback are critical for ensuring fairness in online platforms. This is something that open source and free software development are usually very good at. So you can take a look at those as examples if you want to do any sort of huge web development. Thus far, I've told you that you can't lie, you can't cheat, you need to be very careful when you do anything on the internet, and you can't sell user information without informed consent. And at this point, you might be wondering, well, if I can't do any of that, but I can program, and I can build a web application, what can I do if I can't disrespect my users? How do I make money? So I counter-argue, why is software different than any other industry? Software seems to be the only industry, at least when it's considered to be dealing with the internet, that relies on turning a profit by abusing its users and selling personal information. No other industry does this. Why do we have to? And I really don't think that people should be allowed to do whatever they want. I do think that you should be able to express your creativity and explore technology in whatever fashion that satisfies your curiosity, but you need to remember that software is ubiquitous and its use cases have real-world repercussions, especially as they deal with people. So hack, build, and exploit. Do whatever you want to do and feel that you need to do on the web. Just don't abuse your findings, because we're all trying to make the world a better place here. And building fair web platforms is really hard. There's a lot of bad software out there. A lot. But I don't believe in bad people, and I don't believe in bad developers. I just think that there are bad decisions that can be easily made by making assumptions or just trying to do sketchy things. It's been shown that over time, microtransactions of slightly bad decisions often amount to huge technical and societal debt. And I hope that I can convince everyone today to think really, really hard about the implications of their design decisions, because when you do get it right, it's rewarding for everyone. Yeah, and so I think that I'm pretty much out of time here and we're not taking questions. So if anyone wants to talk to me about this stuff afterwards, I'll be available at the end conference. So thank you for listening. My slides are going to be available at this URL. You can take a look at my notes, and I have a list of resources and links for the things that I've talked about. Thank you for your time.